Hello, and welcome to Module 10, Lecture 6. This is the lecture that finishes off our discussion of monetary policy and the monetarist school of macroeconomics. Last lecture, I left off talking about how there was little political pressure on the Fed in the Great Recession of 2009, 2010 to increase the money supply further. Like there had been pressure on the central bank. We didn't actually have a central bank. There had been pressure on the federal government in 1896 and 1900 by Williams Jennings Bryan to print up more money by allowing money to be backed by silver in addition to gold. Now, whether that was a good idea or not actually depends a lot on the economy of 1896 or 1900, where they're having a big problem with bad recessions. If in that case, probably, yeah, good idea to print up more money. If not, then no, because you'll cause an inflation problem. So let me back up what I said a little bit with quotes from the big political people of the time. I mentioned President Obama didn't seem to be aware that the Fed could do more to get out of the recession, was not putting people on the Federal Reserve Board who would act more strongly. And here's a quote from a book written by Ross Susskind about Obama's early years in Washington. So Obama, because the recession had actually started in 2008, that's the main reason that President Obama won the election of 2008, in that he was a Democrat and the Republicans were in power, so the Republicans were being blamed for the recession. And when he has been elected in November 2008 and he's putting together his economic team, he's introduced to someone who's going to be an important advisor for him, an economist named Christine Romer. And to quote from the book, and you see the words in front of you, that when the president-elect, who hadn't been inaugurated yet, but he would be, the president-elect met Christine Romer in November 2008, one of the early things he said, in fact, the very first thing he said was, it's clear monetary policy has shot its wad. And Christine Romer said, what do you mean? And Obama said, I guess we need to focus on fiscal policy. So somebody had gotten hold of Obama and explained the zero bound problem, made him believe the Federal Reserve Board could not do more, and he did not then press them to do more. Though at the time, Christine Romer says, no, you're wrong, corrects him, there's quite a bit we can still do monetarily, even with the historically low interest rates. And of course, Scott Sumner would be going, well, yeah. So that's when I said the Democrats, led by the president, were not pushing for a stronger monetary policy. It's because the president didn't believe it could be effective. Then I also mentioned, so you think, well, then I'll vote for the Republicans, but they're no better. And to back that statement up, Rick Perry was the governor of Texas in August 2011. So we're getting ready for the election of 2012 of Obama running for re-election, and Obama talking about the Fed chair, Ben Bernanke, who had tried to print up more money. He'd increased the monetary base to do something. Rick Perry said, if this guy prints more money between now and the election, I don't know what you would all do to him in Iowa, but we would treat him pretty ugly down in Texas. Printing more money to play politics at this particular time in American history is almost treacherous or treasonous, in my opinion. So here we have one of the leading Republican candidates basically saying if the Fed printed up more money, the chair of the Fed should be taken out into an alley and beaten up. So that's not a very insightful level of monetary policy. Now, the actual winner of the Republican nomination in 2012 was Mitt Romney, who is now a senator, the only Republican senator to vote, in fact, for the impeachment of President Trump back in early 2020, which seems a long time ago now. And his comment on it, not as bad as Rick Perry's, but Mitt Romney in 2012, I think the right course is steadiness. Don't try to get more money, just keep things steady. Maintain a strong currency and predictable currency. A strong currency here means that it's not losing value to inflation, so don't do anything that risks inflation. And the right course is to get the government, to get the president focused on the issue, which is jobs, jobs, jobs. Job is job one of the president of the United States. Of course, Mitt Romney wants to be president of the United States. So he's saying here that he will create the jobs that Obama was having trouble creating. The interesting thing about this quote is when he says that it's the job of the president to focus on getting jobs by monetary policy, the thing we can do to get jobs, to get unemployment down from its historically, almost historically high levels, is to get people back in the stores buying things. And the way you get people back in the stores buying things is, again, at least according to the monetarists, you print up more money. So Mitt Romney is saying he wants to do things that create jobs, and then he immediately turns around and says, but we shouldn't do the thing that the Fed can do to create jobs. And I said, you're not going to get a recession as bad as the recession that started in 2008, and economy was bad until, goodness, 2014, 5 or 6 years, unless the people at the top don't know what they're doing. And both at the top of the Republican and the Democratic Party, there was a lot of not understanding what the Fed could do to help resolve this, which is basically print up money, increase buying, and move aggregate demand to the right and get back to Q sub n faster. Behind all of this is resistance on the part of people to believe that the solution to a bad recession can be just as easy as printing out more money. And because we're not backed by gold anymore in the monetary system, we often hear it described as printing up money out of thin air. Well, it is true. One way to describe fiat money is to call it being printed up out of thin air. But also another way that is perhaps more accurate is to say it's printed up based on the government's constitutional power to create money. And so the government can make laws against murder out of thin air, and they can print up money out of thin air. Money is a tool. It's a tool we use in the economy to facilitate trading and production. And like, any tool can be used badly, it can be used well. When we talk about printing up more money, sometimes people seem to misunderstand. To talk about printing up more money is good in a bad recession as being, well, then you're saying we should print up money all the time, and then won't that cause inflation? And the answer is yes. If you print up money when we're not in a bad recession, that will cause inflation. But the fact that you can print up too much money or print money up at the wrong time doesn't mean it cannot be helpful to print up more. The amount of money we should have, should be based on our circumstances. It's not that creating money is good or creating money is bad. It's sort of like eating. It's not that it's a rule that it's always better to eat more, or that it's a rule that it's always better to eat less. Eat the amount of food that is appropriate to your circumstances, and create the amount of money that is appropriate to your economic circumstances. You're looking at a slide here that has a chart or a diagram for 5 countries and when they got out of the Great Depression in the 30s. And when these countries' arrows go from dotted or black to colored, that's when they went off the gold standard and could start printing up money out of thin air. And you notice how closely the printing up of more money is tied in with when the recession ended. Japan was the first one to go off the gold standard and start printing up money out of thin air, and their depression was pretty mild and pretty short. And then Britain did it. The US, the red, and Germany, the orange, are pretty similar, right? And then France was the stubborn one. France didn't go off the gold standard so that they could print up more money until the very end, and so they're the one that basically the depression continued all the way through till 1937. So, not proof positive, but evidence here that the sooner a country started printing up money, the sooner they started to end the Great Depression. And the logic is nothing new. It's what we've done in this class, that the Great Depression is a problem of aggregate demand far into the left into the recessionary gap. Nobody's making anything because no one's buying anything. Print up more money. Money's used to buy things. Stores have customers. They make new orders from factories. Factories hire workers. Workers have jobs. and they start to buy things, and there you go. Part of the resistance to printing up more money to fight the recession 2008, 2009, 2010 is the understanding, and the correct understanding, that the Fed printed up too much money in the 1970s and caused inflation. And part of the reason the Fed printed up too much money in the 1970s and caused inflation was they remembered this lesson, that we printed up too little money in the 1930s. So the Fed has a bit of a pattern of, they learn from their last mistake, and when they get into the next mistake will be too far in the other direction. In the 1930s, the Fed did not print up enough money. So in the 1970s, when that was understood, because Friedman had come out with his book, they resolved not to make that mistake again, and then they were printing up too much money and causing inflation. And then when that became understood, people said, well, we won't make that mistake again. And then in 2008, 2009, you saw all these worries about the Fed might print up too much money and cause inflation. Not enough worries about that the Fed wouldn't print up enough money, and that the recession would be long and hard and longer and harder than it needed to be. Though we can say one thing about the Fed and the recession of 2010, and that is they did better than the European Central Bank. The Fed we saw a chart earlier about how the Fed was printing up enough money to keep growth, nominal GDP growth in the U.S. about 4% a year, whereas the central bank had stopped printing up money basically at all, and growth had fallen to zero. And that's because they were only seeing their job as preventing inflation. Now, another reason that the European Central Bank wasn't too worried about the Great Recession of 2010, even though it was as bad in Europe overall as it was in the United States, is the European Central Bank is basically run by the Germans. Somebody has to make the decisions. So these countries, Greece, Spain, Germany, France, Italy, they've given up their own currency and they're using the euro, and somebody has to decide how many euros to make. And the country with by far the most influence of how many euros to make is the Germans, partly because the people have confidence in the German ability to run things more than they have confidence in Italy's ability to run things, partly because Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. But that led to a big problem. We're looking at unemployment let's look at January 2013 first. That's at the bottom of this slide. USA unemployment was 8%, 7.9. Europe was 12% as a whole. And a lot of that has to do with the Federal Reserve printing up money in the U.S. Some argued not enough, but at least they were doing something. And in the euro, the central bank was basically doing nothing. But to say 12% as a whole is, hiding big differences between countries. If you break it down, a year later, Greece was at 26%, Spain was at 26%, the euro area was still at 12%. They'd made no progress. But Germany's only at 5.1%, and the USA is down to 6.6%. We're almost back to normal. But if Germany's in charge, right, Greece and Spain are dying. They're at Great Depression levels of unemployment. They're begging Germany to print up more money. And you get two responses. Number one, the Germans, having lived through the hyperinflation of 1919, have always been very sensitive to the problem of inflation. You ask the Germans to create more money, and they start talking about, I'll tell you what happened in 1919 when we made more money. But the other thing is, basically things were fine in Germany. So when Greece says we're dying, we need an increase in aggregate demand, Germany says, I'm all right, Jack. We don't really have to do much. Things are fine here. Now, if Greece had their own currency, they could have gone ahead and printed up their money on their own. But because they'd handed over the ability to make the money that was used in Greece to the Germans, they had to live with the consequences that the Germans were fine with how things were. We have the same problem here a little bit. The Federal Reserve has to make policy choices on creating money, knowing that things in California are a little different than things in Mississippi. But while we do have differences between states, they're not nearly as big as differences between what's going on in Greece and what's going on in Germany. Did any of the Western economies avoid the Great Recession of 2009? As you look at this chart, you can see the answer is there is one, and that is Australia. And Scott Sumner likes to talk about how the Australian Central Bank was basically the only one who said at the beginning of the recession, we're willing to print up however much money it takes to avoid going into a big bad recession. And what Scott Sumner also loves to point out is they ended up not having to print up all that money they were talking about printing up because people believed them. So they didn't think there was going to be a recession, so they weren't afraid of losing their jobs, so they kept spending the money they had and kept velocity high, and then you don't go into a recession. The theory of the market monetarist that by promising to create money if necessary to get out of the recession, you make, number one, you make people fear inflation. Number two, you raise their confidence they won't get laid off, which leads to them spending the money they have, which means the recession goes away, without the Fed having to do anything other than say they're prepared to print up a lot of money if necessary. Scott Sumner made the suggestion, half serious, half joking, that these other countries, the U.S., should just hire the people running the Australia Central Bank to run the Fed. Let's finish up this discussion of monetary policy with a bit of a review. The difference between how the Keynesians see things and the monetarists see things. They both are looking at this equation, M times V equals aggregate demand. And they're both understanding that the problem of the Great Depression, the problem of the Great Recession of 2010 is you need to increase aggregate demand. So what do the Keynesians think about how you increase aggregate demand? Well, the Keynesians believe that that zero bound problem can keep the Fed from increasing M. You got to increase M times V somehow. If the zero bound problem means you can't increase M, there's only one way to increase aggregate demand, and that's increasing V. And then that's where the Keynesian table comes in. The Keynesians say, we'll borrow the money that people have in their cookie jars, hire people to build roads, and then they'll buy suits, and then tailors will have money, and they'll buy pastries, and so on and so on. So the Keynesians see the Fed as limited in their ability to increase M, so they don't pay as much attention to the money supply. They see the government as having strong ability to increase V through government deficit spending, borrowing of unspent money and spending it, so that's what they emphasize. Now, why do the monetarists think that the government deficit spending in the Keynesian table won't work? Because the monetarists are the ones who believe in crowding out. So they don't think the government can increase V. That the government will end up borrowing money that would have been spent anyway, and thus V doesn't go up. And then the monitors believe the Fed does have the power to create money through by brute force, if nothing else, to increase M even in the zero bound problem. Or Scott Sumner would say, just by saying they're going to do it, you can increase V. But the Keynesians think you have to increase V through government borrowing of money and spending it to hire people to build roads. The market monetarists think you can just increase velocity by the Fed saying they're standing by to create money. So it's still a monetary thing. You don't need government deficits like the Keynesians think. You just need the Federal Reserve Board to behave properly. All right, that finishes this discussion of monetarism and market monetarism and monetary policy. So you know what you have to do now. And that is you have quiz 3, and then you have the unit test reviewing all of the module, and then we'll start the last module, module 12, on international trade. So I'll see you for that. Until then, take care.